Yep.
Yeah, we're recording.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends from Australia who are also joining us. My name is Mike Beam. I'm the Vice President for the Council on Academic Affairs and Research, and this is the first of hopefully many academic and researchers roundtable, and we're really pleased to have a guest all the way from Australia joining us. So next slide, please. Yeah, this topic, ethics in occupational health and safety education, is a really, I think it's a really contemporary topic. I think it's a topic that, in talking to colleagues from around the country, it's something that we really need to look at on a national level. I think that as academics, we can all learn a lot about how we integrate ethics into our professional education for our students and emerging leaders. So from Australia, they've developed something called the Body of Knowledge, which is an absolutely fantastic piece of work that encompasses the breadth of occupational safety and health that is ever growing and ever evolving. And we have a great speaker who has really led that particular effort. Firstly, I want to recognize my partner in crime here, Lou Yuan, who's a professor of occupational safety and health engineering at Southeastern Louisiana University. He's been a great partner to work with in terms of putting some ideas behind these meetings and webinars. And I'm very honored to introduce Pam Pryor, who I actually met Pam a long time ago, back in 2009, I believe it was. I had the opportunity to visit RMIT University, and I linked up with Professor Susan Tepe, who's, I believe, is also on this particular call. And I got to attend a meeting where they were looking at the body of knowledge and kind of kicking it off. So Pam is the manager of the Occupational Health and Safety Body of Knowledge Development with the Australia Institute of Health and Safety, which is our counterpart. She has a background in consulting and OHS education, and now she specializes in activities around OHS capability. She was the chair of the technical panel that developed the OHS body of knowledge, of which you have that one particular chapter, and you can also Google and find all of the particular chapters. She's a member of the International Working Party that developed the Global OHS Capability Framework for the International Network of Safety and Health Professionals Organizations, or INCHPO. In 2018, she received the American Society of Safety Professionals President's Award for this particular work. So it's my pleasure to introduce and to have Pam Pryor lead us in this, of what I hope is a theme over the next couple of years around ethics. So thank you so much, Pam. And folks, I think you're all muted perhaps. And so there's a text chat near the bottom. We're going to stop at about slide 20, I think, and see if there's any pressing questions. And at the end, I hope we have a great discussion. So thank you, Pam, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks Lou and Joe for setting this up. It's great to talk with you all. It's a great pity that I'm not there in person, because that was the original plan that we had many months ago. But this is a substitute, and as Mike says, we hope that it might be part of, well, the first part of an ongoing discussion. You should have all received the slide presentation from Joe. But if you haven't got them, they are available to you after the session. So very happy to share the slides with you. So for health and safety, to me, ethics is just an integral part of our practice. And it's one that perhaps we don't formally and consciously think about a lot, but it's something that we should be doing. And there was actually a study of the profession done a couple of years ago. And what they found was, when looking at the professional identity of OHS professionals, our moral and ethical motivation was one of the things that drove us in our profession. I think the other thing we need to think about is, while health and safety, and I am going to use the health and safety or OHS terminology, because I know if I try and turn it around, for OSH that you use, I'll just keep stumbling over myself. So we have different terminology. But the other thing is, although we might be very highly regulated in our work, regulation and complying with regulation does involve a balance of competing pressures and values. But ethics is different to just compliance with regulations, and we need to think about that. The other thing which I think is really important for us as educators and as OHS professionals is that we've got to get over this idea of ethics is a big thing. You know, I don't have that in my practice. You know, it's not a big deal. Ethics is a big deal in practice, and it is something that we're dealing with every day. So in your role as educators, in your role as mentoring people, we've got to get this idea that it is part of our daily practice. And that's one of the reasons that we set about writing this chapter in the body of knowledge. Building on that idea that it is an integral part of our practice, Mike has already mentioned the Global Capability Framework, of which ASSP was a very active partner in its development. There is a whole section there about competency and skills in relation to ethical practice. I'm not going to go into what it is, but it was recognised there in the Global Capability Framework developed by INCHPO. And so I think as educators, you should be very aware of that framework and have a look particularly at the professional skills and the ethical practice skills. By the way, down the bottom, you'll see some notes about OHS body of knowledge, ethics and professional practice. That's actually the page references in the body of knowledge chapter on ethics, when you've got the slide pack, if you want to go and look at the particular part that I'm referring to. So we've said that it is a part of our ethical practice. And so we accept that, and when we're talking with our students, we need to build that into all of the things we're talking about. It's part of your daily practice, but it will be challenging. So we've talked about regulation. It's more than regulation. So all of our professional bodies have codes of ethics. And so, but it is not good enough to just say, we've got the code, I know what's in the code, whatever. Because ethics is about more than just the code of practice. Because the other issue we've got is some people don't take those codes seriously. If you asked your student members, or if you asked your colleagues who've been members of the ASSP for years, what's in our code of ethics, would they know what is actually in the code of ethics? Could they say that they've referred to the code of ethics in any part of their practice when they felt challenged? Or is it just something that sits in the background and they don't think about it? By the way, just for a little thought, is that when I went searching for the ASSP code of ethics, I had to ask Joe for the link. So one of the things you might like to set your students to do is, can you find the code of ethics on the ASSP website? And maybe Joe might have a challenge to actually make sure that everyone can find it. But that should be the bare basics. Can your students find it, access it, and know what it is? But now, what does it mean? How do we apply it? Let's go into a little bit more detail. One of the things that I find fascinating about health and safety practice, and when we wrote the chapter in the body of knowledge about ethics, was what I see is some of the special things that health and safety people have to deal with in relation to ethics. We've got some issues around technical capability that I'll talk about later. The whole issue of risk, uncertainty, how do we reconcile risk in our various guises and practice? And then we get to managing conflicting duties and managing information. I'm going to come back to these later on, but these are some of the things that I think make it special for us in health and safety about how we talk about ethics and why ethics is a particular challenge for us in our practice. So if we look at what makes people ethically capable, and I'm going to differentiate between ethical competence and ethical capability. Ethical competence is defined as, I know what's in the code of ethics. I can tell you what's in the code of ethics. I can talk about ethical theory, but it doesn't actually go to what I do. If we talk about ethical capability, it's what I'm actually doing and the decisions I'm making and how I'm incorporating it into my practice. So with us, with our peers, with our professionals, with our students we're working with, we want to work towards ethical capability. So sure, we can set them an assignment about what's in the code of ethics, but that's about their competence. And sure, that starts and leads through to capability. But let's take it a little bit further and talk about what do you need to do to put it into practice? In other words, to be ethically capable. We need to, first of all, be aware that this is an ethical issue. We need to have an opportunity to explore in our own mind, explore with others what this is about, what's going on here. And then we need to be able to reflect on that. Reflective practice, think about it. But then we also need some frameworks. So we need some frameworks about making ethical decisions, and also our code of ethics is part of that framework. But we're not going to get anywhere with that unless we have some education in ethics. And that education can be formal in the sort of education programs that you guys might run, or it can be part of CPD programs. But it's also got to have an informal element as well with the peer discussion process. So if we've got these things that lead us up to ethical capability, this is where we started off with the body of knowledge. So if we're going to have competency or capability, we've got to have some knowledge. So this chapter in the body of knowledge was undertaken as a joint project between the Australian Institute of Health and Safety, who curates the body of knowledge, if you like, and BCRSP, the Canadian Board of Registered Safety Professionals. And just as an aside, this whole chapter came about as a result of whoever was talking before about let's have a drink, but it came about over a drink session with people from BCRSP. We both discussed we had some desire to produce some material about ethics. So we were at an INCHPO meeting, we had some drinks, we said, let's set up a project, and it went from there. So I guess that gives an example of how important this international networking is. And I'm really pleased that ASSP has taken the next step, and let's have the discussions internationally as well. When we were sitting down with BCRSP and saying, what are we going to put in this chapter and how are we going to approach it? We had some discussions around scope and depth. And ethics can often get devolved down into very technical, theoretical discussions. Whether you're talking about Kantianism or virtue ethics or any of those other schools of ethics, it can get awfully theoretical. And we said, okay, we'll put that all to one side. This chapter is about providing a pragmatic approach for OHS professionals and OHS educators with students, and providing some frameworks for thinking about our practice. So there's a little bit in the chapter about the theory stuff, but it doesn't devolve down into those very theoretical schools of ethics. So perhaps I should step back a little bit and say, what is the body of knowledge? The body of knowledge came about in Australia back in 2010, 11, 12, when we felt there was a need to define the knowledge that informs our practice. So the body of knowledge is about knowledge. It's not a how-to. It targets OHS professionals, educators and students, and it's written at that sort of level, but it's available to anybody. It is freely available. So if you or your students want to access it, all you need to do is to give your students the link to the chapters. So we do ask that you give links rather than download chapters and circulate it to your students, because then we get an idea about who's using it, and also we can make sure that everybody has the latest versions. So just a comment about the body of knowledge. It's not a textbook, it's not a how-to manual. Our objective is current and leading edge thinking and making sure that it's referenced to the research in the literature. So it does make it read academically, if you like, but that is one of our objectives, is that it is well referenced and well referenced to the research. So that's where we're coming from with the body of knowledge. That sort of sits behind all our thinking about our approach. So back to ethics. And so what we're going to talk about here is ethical decision making, and look at what the research tells us actually is happening when we're making ethical decisions. So it is influenced by a number of things. It's influenced by who we are, what we bring to the decision. It's also influenced by the situation. So our decisions might be different in different situations. and it's also influenced by the environment around us. And so if we go back to our slides earlier where we said one of the first things we needed to have was awareness. So we need to have awareness that there is all sorts of things that come to us in influencing our decision making. So with our students, what we want to do is to develop this awareness and knowledge. So let's look first of all at the personal factors that people bring. And I think one of the really important things for us to understand and to accept is that, and I will quote from one of the research papers, as individuals, we unconsciously favour a particular vision of ourselves as more honest, more trustworthy, ethical and fair than others give ourselves credit for good behaviours. And we also take less responsibility for our moral lapses than others would like us to do. In other words, we're not as good as we think we are. And so I think that that is very important, that we accept that we're human and don't say, you know, it's all about other people and it's not me. So when we're processing information as part of decision making, we need to accept that we have our beliefs and our principles that we bring to this discussion. And there's also, in part of these beliefs and I guess principles, there's also unconscious things like our biases. So, you know, all the commonly accepted biases, confirmation bias, we are more likely to pay attention to information that is consistent with what we believe. The idea of outcome bias, where if the actions that we take are going to be more serious, then we tend to treat those people who make those decisions more harshly. Someone might make an unethical decision, but it doesn't have a huge impact, so we sort of write that off. But if they make an unethical decision and lots of people die, that was very bad. And we tend to treat those things much more seriously. So I think that there is, we need to accept that there's a lot of biases that we bring to us. There's also something that's called moral disengagement. And that's when people tend to separate their everyday ethics from their professional role. And for example, we've had a really big, what we call a Royal Commission in Australia into our banking and finance industry. And some really dreadful things went on. And you just say, how could people possibly make those decisions? Like charging people who are dead for financial advice. And when you think of them, if they were your next door neighbour, you'd probably think they were an all right person. But they go to work and they make different decisions. And you just say, how could they do that? Well, that's something that is moral disengagement. And so that there is all sorts of examples around how those things can happen. So there has been this slide, and you'll need to see the full slide, but what this slide does is summarise what the research says about our aspects or our personal attributes that impact on each stage of the decision making. So, you know, we could go into this in a lot of detail, but all I want us to do is to have a look at that and say, there's a whole lot of things that I can bring to the decision making that are going to influence me. They might be different to other people, but it also might be different for me on a different day. So my patience, my concentration, my perseverance might be different on one day to another, so I might respond differently. So we bring a whole lot of personal things to our ethical decision making. But we also bring a whole lot of professional things, our education background, our experience, who we've been mentored by, those sorts of things. So what perhaps our previous experience was in the profession, how we've been treated. And so there is a whole lot of professional things that the research tells us impact upon our ethical decision making. So some of these things might be things that you would look at when you're looking at your education, and how you might look at how you can influence some of those professional factors as part of when you're discussing ethics with your students. So there's a lot there to absorb and to think about how we as individuals bring different things to making ethical decisions. But when we get to an actual situation, the situation can influence as well. So whatever the situation we're dealing with now might be different. So if we're dealing with a situation which has relatively minor consequences, yeah, doesn't matter much what I do here. You know, I can let this one slide under the carpet. That's what I think. Or if it's going to have huge consequences, maybe I sit back and think about it a bit more. I'm not saying this is good or bad or right or wrong. I'm just saying these are the sorts of things that happen. So this is where we need to be aware of the sorts of things. So the probability of the outcome can affect us. So is it highly likely to happen or not so likely? So, oh, if it's a pretty rare thing, so it doesn't really matter, perhaps if I let this one slip through. The other one that I realise isn't on the slide is social consensus. Everybody's doing it. So it's okay, I can let that one through. So the probability, we've got the timing. Is it going to happen tomorrow or is it in 10 years' time? Tends to affect how we think about things. And our proximity. Is it going to possibly happen to my daughter, my son, my mother? Or is it somebody I don't know? And I think this is one of the things that we face in health and safety is often the people who are wearing the risk are so far distributed from the people making the decisions about the risk. So they're not close to us often in our work. And then the concentration of effect. How many people are likely to be affected by this? One person? A population. So the situation that we're dealing with at the particular time can impact on the decision making. And then I think we're all going to recognise that the environment in which we are is going to make an impact about the decisions. The corporate governance that might be going on. And we've only got to think of Enron, Volkswagen. I think you had something, Wells Fargo went on in the US. So what was going on in those organisations that let people make the decisions that they did? And then we've got the organisational culture and climate, etc. And we're all working within that. And how does that maybe pressure us to make different decisions? And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but Andrew Hopkins in Australia wrote a book called Risky Rewards, where he examined the reward and recognition systems within organisations for managers and how that impacted upon their safety decision making. And so that's quite clear. Whether we're talking about our Australian Banking Royal Commission or some of the things that have gone on in other countries, the way managers and others are paid or recognised or bonus schemes can make a huge impact upon the decisions people make, as can the leaders. If we've got really ethical leaders or leaders that tend to push the margins a little bit, that can make a really big difference, as can social networks. One of the interesting things that I'm finding in health and safety is how the language impacts upon the decisions and the environment. And one of the things I ask people is, do you feel the language in your organisation depersonalises people? Is it all about human capital, human assets, or is it about people? Is there discussions about return on investment, cost-benefit analysis? How ethical are cost-benefit analysis? And if we've got a return on investment and a payback period, and well, you know, it's not going to pay back in a short period of time or a longer period of time, and people tend to tweak the payback periods so that we can get it across the line. Often health and safety investment requires a long payback period. And so we tend to find that people are looking for a short payback period. And so we don't see the benefit in a cost benefit analysis. And so this is where we're still needing to be aware about what's going on. And one of my visions is I would like to see health and safety professionals feel empowered at a senior management meeting to go, hey, what about the language we're using here? Are we talking about how many bad backs have we got? Or are we talking about how many people have been injured in manual handling incidents? Or how many people have been affected by a chemical? So, and what are the impacts that might have on that's people's lives generally? But what about the language? So, as I said, I think this is a really important thing under awareness. Does our language depersonalise people? Or do we talk about workers? Or do we talk about gym in maintenance, for example? So it's those sorts of things that I think comes really important under the heading of awareness. So we've got the factors from the individual, our personal things that we bring to the decision making. We've got the particular situation that we're dealing with at the moment. And then we've got our whole environment within which we're working. And there's just a few things on that slide that we've talked about. And perhaps the social networks and informal and formal systems is an important one also. Because if you've got a social network that includes peers that you can explore your ethical challenges with, perhaps outside your organisation, then that can also change how you act and deal with things. So health and safety, as I mentioned before, I see as a bit of a special case when we deal with ethics. So if we look at codes of ethics, technical capability or having the skills to do the job come up in every professional code of ethics. But in health and safety, we've often got solo operators. We might have new graduates who go into a position in an organisation where they're the only person. So if you've got somebody who, you know, let's say is an accountant, I'll just pick on an accountant or a lawyer, or even an engineer, when they go into organisations, they usually go into graduate programs or programs where they've got more experienced mentors in their organisation. That hopefully is the case with health and safety people, but not always. Especially in Australia, we find people are often going into solo positions in medium-sized organisations. So if they're just expanding and developing their skills, how do they make sure they are technically capable in these solo roles? I'll leave that one up in the air because it leads to things like mentoring programs and networks and whatever, and it's maybe something for another discussion. The other aspect of technical capability which comes up often, and it's not isolated to health and safety, is what I'll call LinkedIn enhancement. Maybe we enhance our skills when we're describing them to people. And this is particularly a risk with consultants, but also we're finding also with people's CVs tend to sometimes get tweaked a little bit to make things look a little bit better than what they are. And is that just making you fit the job, or is that an ethical issue? So we've got two sides to this ethical capability one. The one of which I think for health and safety that separates us out is that issue around solo operators, and how do we make sure as people expand their skills, and also as we're developing into new areas, like how many of our people were experienced in infection control for pandemics in 4 or 5 months ago. So we've got emerging hazards as well. So how do we deal with our technical capability in relation to that? But the one I find really interesting is reconciling risk. So if we're making decisions about risk, how many people really that we're dealing with, maybe that are not OHS professionals, actually understand how complex risk is? It's not putting your finger on 2 bits on a risk assessment or a risk matrix. It is really complex. There is also many interpretations and definitions around risk. And if our students are our graduates and our professionals are dealing with people who have different understandings of risk to what they do, don't understand the complexity, and just want a risk assessment. So we've got those sort of issues. And I made the comment when Mike and Lou and I were talking earlier about risk assessment shopping. How many of our professionals have been subject to presenting a risk assessment and a manager saying, well, could you go back and think about it again? Could you just make it go down a little bit so it fits in this box where there's a different action? So we can be open to pressures because of the uncertainty of risk. And that opens things up significantly. The other thing about health and safety that I think is a little bit different is what I'll call the conflicting duties. Who do we have a primary duty to? If you ask a doctor who their primary duty is to, it's to the patient. A lawyer, their primary duty is supposed to be to justice in the court. If you ask a health and safety person, who's their primary duty? Is it to the worker? Is it to the employer who pays their salary? Is it to their client if it's a consultant? So who is it to the regulator? So there can be all sorts of conflicts of interest arise because of these conflicting duties that we have in the workplace. When we were doing some consultation around the chapter on the body of knowledge, and we ran some focus groups. And so in a couple of the focus groups, I asked people what did they consider their primary duty? And one person said to advocate for the worker in relation to health and safety. And another person said, if I told my employer my role was to advocate for the worker, I'd be out of a job because my employer sees me as part of the management team. So how are you going to reconcile those two things? So I'm not saying that there's an answer, but it comes back to our awareness, our exploration, our reflection, and having the discussion. The other aspect that comes up with us, I think, also is managing information. From a health and safety professional point of view, you might be facing issues of confidentiality, commercial in confidence. You can't talk about that risk assessment or that information. So, but what about an employer's right to know about a hazard and a risk? And then we've got privacy. Privacy is different to confidentiality. Privacy tends to be around personal information, medical information, etc. Do we recognise the difference when we're handling information about privacy, confidentiality, worker right to know? And sometimes there might be contractual obligations around confidentiality. If you're taking a job and you're being asked to sign a confidentiality clause, is that possibly going to have an ethical issue for you later on? And then there's also some aspects around managing information about making public statements. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that is, I think, special challenges for health and safety people. And I think this is where we start to say, this is where it's an everyday challenge. This is not just something special when someone wants to bribe me or whatever. This is coming up all the time. So we get to, that's the theory bit. And there's an awful lot there that we could talk about, tease out, whatever. But now the issue is putting it into practice. Mike, do we want to stop and ask if anyone's got any questions at this stage before we challenge and think about some practice issues?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Pam. Pam has a few more slides left on ethics and practice, and we thought this would be just a good stopping point. We could do text chat. I don't see any text chat questions coming up specifically yet, Pam.
Okay.
Or, you know, we could have an audio question.
Does anyone want to unmute themselves and throw in a question, or would you like to save it till we have chat all round at the end of the day?
There's a text from Jan Wachter. Do you see that text, Pam, or should
No, I can't. You'll have to read it out to me. I can't see the chat.
Are you going to talk about what is quote unquote reasonably practicable?
Aha, good one. In the chapter, we've talked about reasonably practical under the Reconciling Risk discussion. And I think it, again, that is an integral part to our practice. And I wasn't going to talk about it as a separate issue, but certainly I think it's part of that discussion around reconciling risk and all part of risk. And, you know, in Australia, I certainly know the 5 factors that we have from a legal perspective about determining reasonably practicable. But I think it is certainly a discussion that we need to have as to how the two cross over from an ethics point of view. And I think that's some of our special challenge around risk. It's all the risk and the reasonably practicable is integrated.
Pam, do you know what those 5 factors are off the top?
I knew you were going to say that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's the magnitude of the consequences. It's the likelihood of it occurring. It's the cost. It's the difficulty in which it can be addressed. And the 5th one has just temporarily escaped me. Okay, so Mike, we were going to pose a little thinking scenario for people. Did you want to put that scenario, or would you like me to put the scenario to people?
Yeah, there's just one more question maybe.
Okay.
Could Don Elswick asks, out of 40 graduates, we had 24 with no other OHS professionals in their company. So that lone OHS professional that you're talking about. What is the best practice to give support to former students like this?
I'm not sure whether ASSP has a mentoring program, but that's one of the things that we're looking at or are doing through the AOHS is having a mentoring program where we link up experienced professionals with new graduates, or even anybody who wants to have a mentor or coach type person to talk with. I think from a university's point of view, if there is any chance of linking their alumni with their new graduating students, it would present a lovely opportunity for maintaining some continuity of engagement through that. But I think that ongoing area is really where the professional body can have an influence through mentoring. The other thing, which I'll talk to a little bit later on when we get to education, is what we call ethical conversations. So I think there's some relevance around that. So let's save that one a little bit for the education side, I think.
Yep. Do you want to go on?
Okay. All right. So I'm going to pose a little scenario to you. So a young graduate, maybe one of those graduates that have just, well, no, not one of the ones who've just gone out and on their own, because in this case, our little scenario is a young graduate comes to you for advice. A senior OHS professional has sent a report to top management about a particular hazard. And the senior professional has stated in this report that the risk involved is negligible. However, the young graduate has access to the original data and can see that the senior professional's conclusions do not match the data. Moreover, the data doesn't look right. It may have been arbitrarily adjusted or smoothed out a little bit. Some critical information in the raw data is simply unaddressed in the report. The young graduate was hired by the senior professional and he has been a good boss and mentor, and the new graduate feels some loyalty to him. So what would you advise the new graduate to do in this particular situation? So, and also we might say, well, is the situation different if the risk was critical and the senior manager was out of the country, so they couldn't make immediate contact? So let's just park that one in the back of our mind for the moment. We've got a scenario, something like that. So one of the things that we have said earlier is that there's awareness, then there's exploration and reflection. So one of the things that the concepts that we're developing is what we call ethical conversations. So this is around the exploration and the reflection. So what these are semi-structured discussions about work situations that have a potential ethical element. And so this lets everybody explore, discuss in a very safe environment about what these situations might be and how to apply the code of ethics. And we have developed a guide for having these ethical conversations that make them semi-structured. And the vision is that people might get together, 3 or 4 people, usually more than 2, either informally, have a coffee over a Zoom, whatever, and set a scenario and then have a discussion around it. And they're quite set guidelines that we've put together. So through these conversations, they get to explore in their own mind as well as getting feedback from others about how this might work. And I think this is an ideal structure for students. We've got scenarios that you can pose to the students, and as an exercise, you have an ethical conversation in a group, explore it and write your notes. It's also an ideal thing for experienced professionals, or it can be as part of your mentoring discussions. So one of those things for exploration and reflection is ethical conversations. Then when we've had our ethical conversation, we need to be aware that there is models or frameworks for making ethical decisions. And so a very standard decision-making model is the 6-step decision-making model. We've got awareness. And that's what we've been talking about all the way through, is you've got awareness first. And now we've got to have some judgment, some evaluation. So that's where our exploration and reflection comes in, which enables us to make a decision, take action. And then we want to say, well, we've achieved something, and we review it. So this is a pretty simple 6-step model for ethical decision making, which helps people just think about things a little bit more. So if we get to the judgment and decision making, there is, again, a process that we can think about, and we discuss this in a lot of detail in the chapter. So gather the facts. What have you got to do? Do your homework. It's not just about the emotion. It's just, let's find out, and this is what comes out in your ethical conversations about what are the facts and what's the guts of the problem that we're dealing with here, the consequences, who's affected, going through that process. And we've thrown one in, which is check your gut, because that's usually a fairly good indication of things. And then the non-dark blue boxes are parts that we've added because we've got to have that reflection and we've got to have that thinking and review stage. So by giving everybody a structured process of making that judgment and making that decision, it brings it into perhaps how we deal with things in our normal practice. It's about getting the facts, defining the situation, what's the consequences. So there's that side of things about give us a structure, give us a framework. And then we do have to cut to the chase and say, well, you've got to take some action. There's a lot of discussion around whistleblowing. But what we've say in the chapter is before you get to whistleblowing, it's about having, and we've moved from ethical conversations to constructive conversations, about having the knowledge and the skills to speak up within your organisation. And some of you may have heard of Mary Gentile, who's from the US, and she has a program called Giving Voice to Values. And this is a very readable book. And in the chapter on the body of knowledge, we pull out her 10 guidelines for having constructive conversations about how to speak up in your organisation. Her book, Giving Voice to Values, is extremely readable, and I would recommend it to all of you. Through the OHS, we're actually joining with Mary to develop a training program to give OHS professionals the skills to have these sometimes difficult conversations. I think if we're talking about whistleblowing, people need to be aware of the legal issues and also some of the negative issues that can come back on us if we are whistleblowing. And then I think it's quite acceptable, and we have to accept it, that sometimes you just say, I'm out of here. And there are some times where that students and graduates and others might have to accept that this is not the place for me. So they're the sort of action, when we get to the action stage, they're the things that we need to accept our options. So very briefly, that's the theory and the practice. And then I guess the thing is that we've said, what sort of options, what sort of things can we do about incorporating ethics into OHS education? I've given you one thought about ethical conversations, but I think there's a whole lot of things that all of you have probably already done, thought about, would like to share some ideas or throw some ideas around about what we might do. So Mike, I'll pass it back to you. And I realised I warned you that I would talk a lot once I got on a roll. So I did mean to stop earlier for questions, but happy to have questions as long as they go for.
Yeah, no, this is absolutely wonderful, Pam. Thank you so much. I think this really feeds into hopefully what becomes a broader and more detailed conversation that our group has around ethics in OHS education, and how we can think differently and have more of a positive impact on our young professionals and the profession as a whole. So yeah, at this point, it would be great to again hear from the group in text chat or via audio about some of their thoughts, how they integrate ethics into their OHS educational outcomes, or perhaps what you'd like to see next. I have some ideas on what I'd like to see next from our group. but it'd be great to hear from our audience. I think we have about
I
20
think
or
people,
20 or 21 on, so that's great.
I see Don has raised his hand. Let me.
Yeah, I was trying to say if you're time now, I'll go ahead and hit kind of the question I broached because we have some students out there. And just thank you so much. Great presentation. I've got to confess, in one of my classes, a senior class, we used to have them do some ethics research and look at different companies because, of course, most of our students we're training are not going to be North American centric. They're going to have practice that will span the world. But one of the things they brought to me was the AIHS body of knowledge, and we had some time talking about that. So thanks for bringing this in. One of the things that we hit, and the question I ask is, you know, with the 24 people who basically have no support, we've created, you know, a personal text chat and email list that all the students are kind of, even up to 3 years after they graduate, still emailing back and forth. Occasionally I'll get regulatory guidance I send out to them and things like that. So I thought that was valuable. But about a year ago, one of the students came to me, and this was obviously a theme that I heard in the ASSP conference. It's not treat others as you want to be treated, treat others as they want to be treated. And I know with my students at Alabama that are in occupational environmental medicine, that's the same thing too. So with emerging professionals, I mentioned the texts, the emails, some of them are hesitant to do things where they have to be on, let's say, professional networks. Any other ideas from you or the group on how to really mentor them and other great ideas? I'm sure there are some great ideas out there, how to do that and how to build that vulnerability, which we know from our professional life, we can't know everything. A lot of the students think, okay, I have to know everything, and giving them that safety line. So just curious on that.
I'm happy to make a comment, but I'd like to hear from any of the others first. Mike, perhaps you could pick on somebody that you know and say, well, what are you doing about ethics at your university?
Or Mike, just blow the question off as a terrible question.
No, it's not a terrible. I think it's a really important question about maintaining things ongoing. No. And you've left it open to me, so I'll have to provide an answer. I think that your comment about getting people to open up, I think, is really important. And I think that comes back to my comment really early on about awareness and acceptance that this is an everyday challenge. It's not something that's special or to be closed in a box that I don't want to talk about because I'm not handling it or whatever. It's something that we've got to open up and be free to have that, feel free to have that discussion within a safe environment. And I think that's where the ethical conversation stuff, have a look at the other thing is, I'm just going to go slightly ahead, is that on your slide pack, there's a whole lot of links that I've put in relation to the body of knowledge and also the resources that are on the web page about ethical conversations, sample scenarios, and that the question before, the sample scenarios might be something that is useful because let's have an ethical conversation using somebody else's scenario. So it's not me that's having to open up about whatever's going on in my professional life. Let's pick something abstract that might be someone else. And then we can start to say, well, the other day this challenged me. So if it's with students or if it's with new graduates, the idea of using some of the scenarios might be a useful way of having a chat. The other thing with your network of emails, etc., one of the things might be interesting is to say, like a round table. Maybe you could have a round table discussion of only open it up to 4 or 5, whoever registers first, and say, of our new grads, let's have a round table and see how you're going, what you'd like to discuss, and throw in the idea of an ethical conversation. So you might be able to use your email list in that way. Just a couple of thoughts.
I see we have another question in the chat, as well as Jan has his hand up. Jan, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, sure. I actually teach an ethics class, and what's worked really well is I pose to students an action or behavior that I think the majority of them would say, hey, that's an ethical action. And then I pose something which most people would say, without any additional information, that's an unethical action. And then for each of them, I give them an additional piece of information that they didn't know initially to see how it changes their perception of how ethical or non-ethical the situation is. And that's really interesting to the students because they see them changing their own opinion about the base action that they either thought was, oh, this is an ethical action or an unethical action. But once you know the situation, the context of everything, they start changing their minds. Then they become reflective and say, here are the biases I bring to the table when I make ethical decisions. Some people don't change their mind, whatever, given the contextual situation. So their mind is made up and they have a bias against assimilating new information. And other people really look at consequences and they have a predominance of looking at consequences. That has worked really well because people like self-discovery in classes because you're reflecting it back to them and they're interested in what they ultimately think. So that's really worked very well. And
I think that sounds really great. And I like the way you're pulling out an awareness of the biases that they bring and that they might well have been unconscious beforehand. I really like that.
I'll tell you what hasn't worked is when I throw up the code of ethics or conduct from ASSP or AIHA, it's just a snoozer. You know, it's like just words on a piece of paper. You have to operationalize it and make it real. Not to say anything against ASSP and their code of ethics.
And I think that's where the scenarios are important. And I don't know if we very quickly through that scenario of a young person coming to you for advice and whether you had an opportunity to think what your advice might have been. But I think that's why we went away from the theory of ethics in writing the chapter to giving people some practical frameworks and advice. So I absolutely agree with you there. You know, somewhere or another, there's got to be an awareness of the code, but that's down the track. I think you've got to get an interest in what's going on first.
So this is Jennifer McNally. I'm the CEO for good to see you all on the line. And I actually chair or the staff liaison to our Code of Conduct Committee. So when I can say what you've said, that is to me a challenge and a hill to be climbed, because I will say even in my limited 2 years at the Society, we've had a shift in how we've looked at the Code of Conduct, what our expectations are, what we're communicating and how we do that. And we've been working really closely with legal on this because there's a whole set of behavioral norms, and Mike and I have talked about this in the link in the context of diversity, equity, inclusion, ethics, all centered on people behavior, how we show up, how we interact, and the number of ways that equally comes into play with where people can interact and what the expectations are. And a lot of the feedback that I've received from volunteers is, well, I didn't think that was a code of conduct issue, or I didn't think that. So even being able to parse out, as we're hearing today, a base understanding from a scenario perspective. And that's a piece of what we're trying to do this year, is actually roll out training that looks at scenario basis. So feel free to continue to push us on the code, because it's only words on a website don't create the environment that we expect of ourselves and our professionals. So I'm happy you said that. Thank you.
And that's good. And nice to talk with you. Would it be nice to have an opportunity to have a broader discussion? But what might be of interest is there's quite a lot of research around codes and the difference between a code of conduct and a code of ethics. And there is a subtle difference, but a really important difference between the two. And what we've been doing with at the AAHS as a result of the chapter is we've revised our code of ethics for professional practice, but we have a code of conduct with the business of the organisation, if you like. So there is a difference, and happy to talk about that in another forum. But there is quite a bit of research around codes of ethics and the differences. And while legal is really important and we've got to keep the legals happy, sometimes there can be, especially at the code of ethics level, it can get distracted, I think. So just another discussion there, perhaps. So back to you, Mike. Any other education challenges, questions?
I think you actually answered, I think, or partially answered Lou's question about different types of codes. He had a question about the different types of codes in the chat, which is a really interesting one.
Lou, did you want to say anything else to that?
Actually, I raised that question because I heard all the other folks talk about the education part. Some have courses maybe in the curriculum, others may put ethics in different courses. So then one of the questions, which code do we use to educate students? Is that ASSP or BCSP, AHA, or other codes? Because there are just so many. I mean, I'm assuming many of those are in agreement with each other. But is there a golden standard in the OHS or OSH that we shall use so that we can be all consistently at the same, stage or level?
It's an interesting comment and question. When we were developing the chapter, one of our subject matter specialists was a business ethicist, not with a health and safety background. And her comment was that the accountancy associations internationally all sign up to the same code of ethics. So whether you're in the US, Canada, Botswana, Australia, or UK, if you're a member of an accountancy professional body that's registered with the international body, you all agree to the same code of ethics. So we actually made a comment that we think that's a limiting factor in health and safety related areas, that we all have slightly different. We all mean the same thing generally, but you're quite right. There are differences amongst them. And it's one of the things that I would like to see INCHPO take on is there scope to define a common code of ethics? One of the early activities of INCHPO was that they looked at consistent factors across codes of ethics. But that was just looking at the current ones and saying what's consistent. And that's sort of like 10 years old. And I think we've moved on a lot since then. So I think it's a deficiency in our profession that there are all of those differences. But from an educator's point of view, I think the comment's been made that the code of ethics is almost secondary. It's about understanding ethics, understanding what influences us, understanding the principles. And once you've done that, an interesting educational thing might be to look at the codes of ethics and how they vary. And when I used to teach ethics, one of my final activities, after looking at half a dozen codes of ethics and having the discussions, etc., I asked the students, I gave them all an index card, and I asked the students to write their personal code. So what were their lines in the sand? What were their major things going to be for them in their personal, professional life? So I asked them to write it. It's the last activity of the session. Write it down, put it in your pocket, keep it whatever's handy, and then just reflect on it as time goes by. This is my personal code. So whether that's a useful activity, but I think it's a challenge for us in health and safety is what should it be? What should be the gold standard if there is one? Don't know. So when we were having our discussions, so we've discussed competency versus capability, and Mike and Lou and I discussed this earlier. So we've talked about awareness, exploration, reflection, and then making decisions within a framework. So I think they're the sorts of things that we need to be tackling when we're talking about incorporating ethics into OHS education. Now, Lou also raised this question a while ago when we were having a discussion about should ethics be standalone, as in here's your ethics unit, or should it be integrated into your other educational activities? Open to discussion. My thought, how I responded to Lou's question at the time was, I think we need to have a dedicated area where we have a discussion about the things we've talked about today, about awareness, about biases, about personal factors, situational, environmental. Here's a model. But then I think we also need to give the very strong message that it's an integral part of practice. So somewhere in your assignment type process is, how do you incorporate that? Do you have capstone projects, or do you have projects where people are writing a report, be it a report on a risk assessment? So can you integrate an ethical element into those activities? So once you've done the basic discussion, is there every opportunity you can take to say you've got to include, and is there an ethical element somewhere? So I would go for both of those options. But Lou, would you like to make a comment? Yeah, thanks.
Sure. I think the other question relevant would be, for the courses that discuss ethics in the curriculum, they are probably taught by different faculty members. And they may also have their own take or belief or preference or understanding or interpretation of the codes. So when a student take courses from multi-educators or advisor or faculty members, I guess especially if there is a different opinion or different way of doing things, who shall they go by or follow, after? That's another question. Then if we expand this to more than one program across the country, across the globe, and we all teach or educate students on ethics, but are we doing the same or similar things? Or there are also different understanding or different way of doing or different interpretation of the same codes? Then also the question.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think my comment to that would be, and it also comes about where you raised the question about assessment when we were having a discussion earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How do you assess ethics? And my comment is, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I don't think as marking an assignment, I can say you made the wrong decision here from an ethical point of view. And I think it comes back to the person who was making the comment before about how they feed in different factors into the scenario that they give the students in the education. So there's no right or wrong answer, but if I was assessing an assignment for ethics, I would be looking at how they've looked at those awareness, exploration, reflection type activities, and how they've examined themselves, examined the situation, examined the environment for what might have impacted upon the decision. So if we're teaching different things in the different countries, I'd be saying if we're actually teaching awareness, exploration, reflection using some models, I don't think it matters. I think we just need to make sure that we're not saying that something is okay in one environment. So sorry, that something's black and white. Because if you're educating somebody and they go and work in an African country, then the ethics of operating there and the factors affecting them may well be quite different to working in the US, Canada, or Australia, or whatever. So I think that we need to be very careful about saying that our education is about awareness, reflection, exploration, and applying some frameworks. It's not about teaching this is right or this is wrong. So that's just my thought, but I'm happy to open it up for anybody else as thoughts.
And I think there's some good comments in the text chat as well, in terms of ABET accreditation and the professional ethics component of ABET accreditation, the differences between legal and ethical, and then the need to enforce ethical codes. There's some other great there's some other great comments as well too.
Mac, just want to say that one of the attendees, Mr. Rick Sazon, raised his hands. So I think he may have something to say. I don't know if you have seen that, so
I've not, sorry.
that's okay.
Please, Rick.
Rick, yeah, Rick Sazon, yeah. Hey, Rick, I need to unmute, or maybe Joe, you can unmute him.
I believe Rick, is Rick Sazan correct?
Yes.
Yeah, here. I think he has to unmute himself. I just asked him to unmute on Zoom.
All right. Yeah, it's good.
I think with the accounting universality, the laws across that were developed initially to monitor and standardize accounting were initially done in a few places, like this country and perhaps Western Europe. And then all the other countries kind of adopted those laws or standards. In OHS, the standards that we have to live by are widely different from Asia to Africa to the US to Canada. Well, Canada, US, and Australia, they're kind of, closer together. They're still not together, but closer together. And it's going to be hard to come to consensus simply because the standards that they live by are so widely varied. I mean, I think they're still building scaffolds in China out of bamboo poles. It's hard to bring consensus when you've got that kind of disparity.
I agree.
That's really all I have to say.
What was it? Life wasn't meant to be easy, which is that was a politician's phrase in Australia many years ago, and it pops up every now and again. But I guess that doesn't mean that we give up. But yeah, there might be ways, and I think it's a discussion that I would like to see InchPost start to have. I'm not saying that it would be an easy one, but I think it's a very relevant one. So maybe we can pass that on to them. So Mike, over to you.
Yeah, Pam, thank you so much. I think this is a great discussion, and I think there's a lot of great ideas. I hope that folks are energized around this particular topic, and you'd like to keep this conversation going, and see how ASSP can develop some tools or some networks to have ethical conversations, and to look at case studies and to evaluate scenarios and to begin that discussion both in our universities but also at a broader society level. I certainly thank Brad Giles and Jennifer McNally for being here, and Christine Sullivan as well too. Lots of ASSP leaders interested in this particular topic, and Pam, we want to give you a real big round of applause, and thank you for coming in this morning early for you. So we really appreciate you getting up early for us, and we know all the work that you put into this particular presentation and the body of knowledge in general. It's just it's a great lasting thing for us to go back and take a look at. So we're very, very appreciative of your time and your expertise.
It's good fun, Mike. I always enjoy talking with you and with the ASSP people, and maybe taking a leaf out of our own book. I talked about ethical conversations in small groups. If you and any of the group want to have a smaller Zoom discussion and get down into some nitty-gritty of the education stuff, sharing ideas, happy to do that in the future.
Have a lot of accolades coming in, and Brad has some great ideas. And I think we were gonna try to all have a virtual happy hour. Is that right? Joe
Yes,
and Will?
yes, our plan is to now do a virtual happy hour. I'm sure it might be a little less happy for Pam as it is 8 a.m. now.
Yeah, it's, I'll tell you, it's 10 past 8 in the morning. So I think my capacity for happy hour is a bit limited, but I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone if they want to do that.
It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
I was going to say multiple people have already written mimosas in the chat.
It looks like Cindy
Absolutely,
and Jennifer are on the
yeah.
same page there.
Yeah. So we were going to do the happy hour we are going to split you all just into 2 rooms so that we can actually facilitate or have a conversation rather than have all 30 of us in the same area like this. So we will be, you all will be ushered into a breakout room in a couple seconds, and then our plan was to change the order of the breakout rooms every 15 minutes or so. So we'll come in, we can move you all around so you all will be able to talk to everybody, but still have a conversation and not get swamped out by just a couple people. So,
All right. Well, I might leave you to the breakout rooms, but if anyone wants to stay on this section, if they're allowed to, Joe, if they've got any questions, happy to answer those. But otherwise, I'll leave you to your